Greetings. I'm Detective Sergeant First Class Harry Gavel, Camden County Prosecutor's Office Homicide Division, retired. I'm coming to you today live from the Murder Capital podcast studio in Sarasota, Florida. I'm going to get off script a little bit. This is not a story about an actual homicide that I investigated. This is a different story about where murderers used to be sent back in the day when they were condemned to die in prison for their heinous crimes. The story of my visit to Alcatraz Island. Listener discretion is advised due to some of the graphic nature of the content. Alcatraz, the Rock, Pier number 33, United States Federal Penitentiary, or just Alcatraz Island. Take your pick, whatever you want to call it. It could never change the image. It was the hole in hell from which there was no escape. It usually meant the end. Until it wasn't. Or was it? The question still remains to this very day. Some 63 years since its closing as a federal prison. I was there. I was a 44-year-old homicide detective in 1993, working at the Camden County Prosecutor's Office. Alcatraz had closed some 30 years earlier. In 1963, however, it was still open to the public as a major tourist attraction and museum of sorts. 20 years earlier, in 1973, before my Alcatraz visit, I requested and was granted permission to sit in Trenton State's electric chair, old Sparky. Now, of course, I made sure everyone in the room stayed way clear of the breaker box, which glared prominently on the wall nearby. The last person fried to death in that chair happened 10 years earlier. His name was Ralph Hudson. On January the 22nd, 1963, he was convicted of stabbing his estranged wife Myrtle to death as she worked in an Atlantic City restaurant in New Jersey. Now, in 1993, the chair was still on the books as a legal method of exacting the state's death penalty. Some 160 death row inmates had been already executed in that very chair, but it hadn't been used since the execution of Ralph Hudson. In the year 1983, 10 years after I sat in it, it was abandoned as a deterrent and replaced by the more humane method of lethal injection. In 2007, Governor John Corzine abolished the death penalty in the state of New Jersey completely, much to the dismay of the administration of criminal justice in New Jersey. In my opinion, having the chair on the books as a legal option, it was not only a deterrent to crime, it was a huge tool for homicide detectives and prosecutors to often use as an effective bargaining chip in a murder case where it could prove very valuable as a leverage for information, especially for recovering a murdered victim's body. Even though it wasn't being used, it was still worth its weight in gold as a law enforcement tool. As a homicide detective at the prosecutor's office, I became interested in not only the murderers I pursued in my work, but also the institutions in which they were housed. I was given the opportunity to be a member of the Camden County Prison Board by a then Camden City freeholder, Doctor of Education, Edward McDonald. Touring prisons and learning about their very diverse intricacies became a subject of interest to me. In 1993, I had decided to spend that vacation year in San Francisco, California, in the very city on which Alcatraz Island stood as a ghost from long ago. It was the infamous Rock, Alcatraz Prison. Now, I had done my research on the prison. I located the ferry schedule which provided the boat ride out of the island and scheduled my trip. I was anticipating it very much. I saw it as an impossible idea of a poor city kid from Camden, from where I was born and raised, but now it was going to be a reality. I was very much looking forward to it and very much appreciated the opportunity to be going. In August of '93, the wife and I booked our hotel room at the famous St. Francis Hotel in downtown San Francisco. Now, that was just a short trolley ride to the Fisherman's Wharf, where the sea lions pile on top of each other, basking in the warm Frisco afternoon sun, where Lefty LaFrisco, a cartoon artist, has tourists lined up waiting for him to do a cartoon sketch of them while you were there killing time, waiting to board the ferry boat to the Rock, or as you wait your turn to be seated in a restaurant for your anticipated dinner. Now, the wife was with me on this trip, so I had a plan to do certain actual tourist activities with her, such as, visit wine country and the such, take bus tours here and there. However, I was laser focused on being on that ferry boat ride to the Rock, and I knew I would be attending the execution of a serial killer by the name of David Mason. He was set to be executed in San Quentin's state penitentiary in the gas chamber, and this would occur during my time there. Now, San Quentin was another prison that I definitely wanted to tour, and I also wanted to be there during the execution of this madman. That was a plus. I wasn't going to miss it. I told the wife in advance that I'd be planning that boat ride to Oakland, to San Quentin Prison. The execution was scheduled for 12:05 a.m. on Tuesday, August the 24th, 1993. As a matter of fact, just as a precaution, I looked into whether or not I'd have to get there the day before so that I wouldn't miss it. She understood. As the ferry boat was slowly cutting its way through the fog on the very early morning hours of August the 24th, just as the state prison of the infamous San Quentin came into view, I was first surprised and marveled at a little that the walls were very tall, which surrounded and encased the prison. They were built on a certain degree of a slant, which slanted inward and were very high, topped with razor wire. Now, at various strategic locations, you could see what appeared to be gun turret watchtowers. These towers were occupied by armed uniformed guards. We were told they were armed with machine guns and had strict orders to thwart any violation of off-limit space by any inmate and to enforce it with deadly force. On the grounds around the base of the prison, I could see that there were several contingents of media which had already gathered. They were there setting up and preparing to cover the execution. There were several small groupings of what appeared to be sign-carrying protesters, some with bullhorns, many with cameras, demanding the execution be stopped. I assumed, given Mason's criminal record of his past and present, that these people protesting were bleeding heart groups, activists, if you will, who were against the death penalty. Mason had spent his last day visiting with friends and family. At approximately 6 p.m., he was escorted under guard to the death watch cell. There he was given unlimited access to a telephone to converse with his family members. He flat out refused to have a last meal of his choice within reason. He only requested ice water while in the death watch cell. In the death watch cell, which is removed from your death row cell, the inmate is placed under heavy surveillance for close watch. This is to ensure that no last-minute suicide occurs before the state gets you strapped in the death chamber so your final breath on earth can be witnessed. At 2 minutes before midnight, Mason is escorted to the gas chamber. At 12:08 a.m., Warden Daniel Vasquez stepped into the chamber. He pointed out where Mason's attorney was seated. He was seated in the witness section. Mason was asked if he wished to change his mind and have the proceedings stopped. His response, and I quote, "No, Warden. I want to proceed. Thank you, Warden." Unquote. At precisely 12:09 a.m., the lethal cyanide gas was introduced into the death gas chamber. At 12:23 a.m., Mason is pronounced dead. It was uncanny to me that seconds after the execution, the sympathizers outside the prison walls knew somehow that the death sentence had been carried out. As they chanted and moaned, some lifted their signs of protest, others lowered them towards the ground. They knew, and I wondered how, so quickly. Now, I had gone to the prison by myself after touring Alcatraz Island. David Mason was a very troubled serial killer who, as a young person, unsuccessfully tried many times to end his own miserable life of crime. As a child, he tried choking himself, setting himself on fire, swallowing pills, cutting himself, throwing himself down several flights of stairs. He often would be heard saying, "I know I'm going to die. I don't care. In fact, I look forward to it." His prior criminal record before the murders consisted of, number 1, robbery with intent to murder. Number 2, assault and attempted robbery. Number 3, robbery with false imprisonment. Number 4, several and various weapons charges. Now, in addition to all that, he was convicted of murdering 5 people. He was at age 36, the first inmate to abandon his legal appeals and go willingly to the death chamber. He was only the second person in 26 years put to death by the state. The first was Robert Alton Harris. That's another story. Mason had preyed on the elderly and the weak. His first victims were all elderly women. His last victim was his own cellmate while he was in San Quentin prison cell. This guy was the poster child for what a career criminal serial killer looks like. There was no place for this man to be living in society. The kind of criminal who will not change, cannot be reformed or rehabilitated. Society must protect themselves from such elements of evil, pure and certain evil. Mason knew that he would not change. He was who he was. He wanted to die because he knew he couldn't reform. He didn't want to, period. The highly anticipated day came for our visit to the Rock. I got up super early on this morning. The ferry boat was to leave the dock from Fisherman's Wharf at 8 a.m. sharp. From the moment I opened my eyes, the anticipation was great. It was a foggy morning, typical for San Francisco, and exactly like I appreciated it and pictured it. As we ate a nice breakfast and took the short trolley down to the wharf, you could hear the foghorns bellowing out in the distance, in the fog which engulfed the San Francisco Bay. And you had sightings of tugboats and ships from which the bellowing foghorns were emitting from it. It was spooky, and it was haunting, just like you were watching an old James Cagney or Humphrey Bogart movie. You were there, man. You were now in lockstep, following your orders on your ticket. Arrive 30 minutes early. Ferry waits for no one. This day would prove to be way more than I could ever expect. The next several hours on Alcatraz prison grounds, the day I spent there was full, was entertaining, and was unforgettable. The visit to that island of Alcatraz and the San Quentin State Prison spoke volumes to me. We arrived more like an hour before boarding time. We arrived at the pier, number 33, and we knew we were at the right place. It was fine that we were early. There were several other tourists that were there already. We grabbed the coffee and an ever-present hunk of sourdough bread, which is to die for on the wharf. It goes great with a cup of steaming hot coffee. While even though it was August, at the Frisco Bay mornings, you huddled damp and chilly on the dock, where you were standing and waiting in standing room only. As you waited, you had time to read about some of the history of Alcatraz and what to expect once you got on the prison grounds. It housed some of the country's most notorious criminals. Here are the likes of a few. Al Capone, from 1934 to 1939. He was there for tax evasion. Robert Franklin Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, held there from 1942 to 1959. Would you be surprised to learn that Stroud never had one bird at Alcatraz during his 17 years on the rock? That's a fact. The fact also is that he had birds while he was at Fort Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. There he would raise and sell birds while studying their illnesses. He was a pimp by occupation, but not at Alcatraz. In 1909, after shooting and killing a man, a bartender who attacked his mistress, he turned himself in to Alaskan authorities. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. A federal penitentiary known as McNeil Island in Puget Sound. He earned a reputation as a cunning and dangerous criminal and an inmate. In 1916, he stabbed and killed a guard. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. That sentence was commuted to life in prison. In 1920, while in solitary confinement at Leavenworth Federal Prison, Stroud discovered a nest with 3 injured sparrows in the prison yard. He cared for them. Within a few years, he had required a collection of about 300 canaries. He began extensive research. Soon after gaining access to equipment by a prison reforming warden, he was able to smuggle his writings out of the prison. His writings were on canary-related diseases and cures. He was able to have his books published, the first one in 1933, the second edition in 1943. He was most noted for a cure of hemorrhagic septicemia. It was a family of diseases. When prison officials discovered he was secretly making alcohol with some of the equipment he was granted for his birds, this activity infuriated the prison staff. So in 1942, he was transferred to Alcatraz on December the 19th of that year. That's where he spent the next 17 years locked in a cage on the psych ward, completely birdless. He was a deranged psychopath, but with an IQ of 112, and respected by ornithologists of the time. Stripped of his birds and equipment, he wrote a history of the penal system. It was to become well known. The Battle of Alcatraz, you may have heard of it. That was in May of 1946. Stroud made efforts to protect other inmates. Then, at age 56, he climbed down from the 3rd tier, lowered himself to the floor of D block. That was the lower floor. When he climbed back up, yelling to the captain of guard, Captain Philip Bergen, to please stop bombing D block, stating that there were no firearms there. He had checked, thus saving inmates from impending sudden death. In 1959, at age 69, Stroud was transferred to the medical center for federal prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He stayed locked up there until his death on November the 21st, 1963, the very year Alcatraz closed as a federal prison. The great Burt Lancaster portrayed his character on Escape from Alcatraz. Number 3, George Machine Gun Kelly, 1934 to 1951, in there for kidnapping. In 1951, he was transferred to and died at Leavenworth 3 years later. He was a hardened criminal. James Whitey Bulger, 1959 to 1962. He was there for robbery and hijacking. Mickey Cohen, inmate known as number 1518, from 1961 to 1963. He was in for tax evasion, and he was a Jewish mafia figure, much like Capone, tax evasion / mafia figure. The ferry boat ride seemed to know how to navigate the bay by itself, to tell you the truth. Pier number 33 was the only pier from which the ferry boat accommodated tours to the Rock. It only takes about 15 minutes to cut across the strong tide. The first thing you note is that everything seems to be timed to a T. The rules and regulations about bringing any type of food or weapons or contraband of any kind was strictly prohibited and stringently enforced. It feels like the prison is still dictating rules and regulation as if it were still an active federal prison. It was not, but is strictly ran by the Park Service's uniformed rangers. As we drift steadily toward the docking area at Alcatraz, the Rock becomes now in full view. It appears like a ghostly grayish fortress, encased in large boulders and rocks, spattered in seagull droppings. Tall brick and concrete walls which comprise of the main cell house, where the inmates were housed in their cells. The warden's quarters, which were situated near an opposite end of the grounds, appeared partially dilapidated, and you could hear the ever-present seagulls squawking and singing their song. It seemed to be a constant presence there. Alcatraz was once used and occupied in August of 1861 as a Civil War prison camp. There they incarcerated Confederate prisoners of the Civil War. It was also used to confine American Native Indians for several months on sedation charges. That's disobedience of the government. It became a federal prison from 1934 until closing in 1963. In November 1969 to 1971, a group of Native American activists occupied Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz Island is still open for tourism to this day. I strongly encourage you to drop in for a look at what a real prison was like. As soon as we docked, we were met by park rangers who instructed us where to gather and to go in a single file as a group, under guard, and to be given orientation. A headset and tape recording with the cassette player was given. This would be used to guide you by the numbers during your tour of the block. While standing there awaiting further instructions, I got talking to one of the park rangers standing vigil over us. I informed him that I was a New Jersey homicide detective and was greatly anticipating the tour. He says, "Homicide detective? I go on lunch break shortly. Forget this guided tour. I'll take you on the real tour behind the scenes. The tour that the public does not get to see or hear about. Are you interested? Meet me right here in 20 minutes, I said, Like, hell yeah. Not only yeah, hell yeah. Well, we began our private tour by first walking down the main hall of the prison on the first level. It was known as Broadway. At or near an intersection, there was a primitive-looking barber's chair. This was the barber shop. It is where the escapees gathered human hair for their planned escape, which they did in fact pull off on June the 11th, 1962, after years of planning. Frank Morris had an IQ of 133, which put him in the top 3%. He was the ringleader. They could only collect small droppings of cut hair from the floor at the barber shop at any given time, due to not wanting to alert the guards that they were collecting hair. That would lead to their plan being interrupted. Instead, they practiced patience. Next, we were taken to the actual cells of the Anglin brothers. Clarence Anglin, cell number B152. John Anglin, cell number B150. Frank Morris, cell number B138. Their rooms had been refurbished to appear exactly like they were on the night of their daring escape. In the escape, they used a homemade, ingenious bar spreader, spoons which were stolen from the kitchen mess hall, sharpened and used as digging tools. They made papier-mâché life-size heads on which they glued the human hair and painted images on the faces, complete with ears, noses, and mouths. These were still seen in their beds as they were left upon their escapes. They had painstakingly dug away at the surfaces around the small ventilation ducts in the cell walls. Taking the cement they removed, putting it in their pockets, and while in the courtyards, they would slowly release the dirt which would travel down their pant leg to the ground silently without being observed by the ever-present armed guards. This was a tedious undertaking, and it took a long time. A fourth inmate by the name of Alan West, prisoner number 1335-AZ, he was involved in the escape plan as well. It was his second stay at Alcatraz Hotel. He just could not get the ventilation grate removed from his cell in time. He was left behind. Little known is the fact that it was West who first identified a, quote, way out, unquote, and devised the concept for the escape. Now, a guy by the name of Clarence Carnes was also another inmate and a co-conspirator in the early stages of the plot. He didn't go. Now, once outside their cells, they quickly teamed up and assisted each other to navigate the difficult climb to the roof, where they were going to access a rooftop vent. Once there, they inflated their makeshift rafts of some 50 glued together raincoats. They lowered and scrambled the sole raft to the ground and entered the frigid bay, complete with strong and dangerous undercurrents. There is great speculation that they drowned. The authorities scoured every inch of the escape route, all the way down to the water's edge, and even dragging the waters of the bay. They were never to be found, seen, or heard from again. The FBI closed the case of the hunt for them in 1979. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department receives a letter stating it is from John Anglin. He mentions his current age, his date of escape, and in true criminal inmate fashion, he states that he wants to make a deal. And he states, get this, we all made it out. He was now the sole survivor of the group, but he was suffering with cancer. He was requesting to turn himself in with the guarantee that he would only have to do 1 year in prison in exchange for medical care for his cancer. Just like a con, trying to dictate to the authorities what he wants. They disregarded the information. They followed it up to some degree, but eventually disregarded it. They were never able to confirm that it was actually Anglin himself. We were taken up through several secluded doors which led to the rooftop. We walked the rooftop, the exact route taken by the escapees. We saw the vent that they came out of and followed the route that they followed. You could feel in the air the freedom they must have experienced with a view of the mainland within their grasps. Next, we were taken to the cell of inmate number AZ-85, cell number 138, the home of Alphonse Al Capone, aka Scarface. As my wife was filming, I pretended to be using the urinal inside the cell while looking back at the camera. They shut the door. The ranger locked me in. I didn't panic, though. I knew that they were joking around. Right? Luckily, they were. I had laid down on the cot set up in the cell of Al Capone and recalled the notion of just saying to myself, what if I want to do something or go somewhere? Or I need something on the outside? Man, when your freedom is taken away, it affects many things in your daily life that we tend to take for granted. Let me out of this mother. I then next asked about solitary confinement. The ranger says, I'm going to show you the real solitary confinement cells. The ones they show and tell you about in the tour is not the actual hole. But first, we're going to pay a visit to the psych ward. The psych ward is where the Birdman of Alcatraz was kept. Robert Franklin Stroud, inmate number 594. He occupied the largest cell in the entire prison. Don't ask me why, I don't know. It was away from the main cell house. He was considered way too dangerous to be around other inmates. Perhaps that was the reason. When we got to the psych ward, we were told that inmates who were considered criminally insane were kept and treated here. I recall as I walked around inside the psych ward seeing rickety old steel, barbaric-looking dental chairs is what they appeared to be. Chairs used in a 1930s or 40s dental office. Dilapidated gurneys with torn frayed coverings. Steel slabs like you would see in an autopsy room. Vacant, of course. A bare wooden stage with a wooden platform where the inmate bands used to play for the inmates locked up there. Believe me, this area was hideous looking. The Birdman cell was long and wide. I guesstimated to be about 30 feet long by 15 or 16 feet wide, probably 3 times larger than the typical cells on D Block, where the main prisoners were housed. Those cells measured 10 feet by 4 feet 5 inches wide. We also saw remnants of hand-drawn sketches of birds and what a bird disease looked like, hand-sketched on the walls of the cell of inmate number 594. Just standing in that puke green painted cell room in which the paint was peeling off the walls made you feel like vomiting. The stark quietness, except for the seagulls heard squawking off in the distance. If a slightest sound was made, it would echo off in the distance, and you had no idea what made the sound, nor did you want to know. Next, we descended to under the prison walls. Now, this was the actual dungeon they called the hole. If you screwed up good enough, and the warden ordered solitary, the inmate was stripped of his clothing, all of his clothing. He would be escorted by force, if necessary, to the basement dungeon, where he would be shackled to a bull ring which was encased into the actual concrete foundation walls. If you were resisting on the way to the dungeon, you might get your ass kicked and have one of the officers bounce a baton off your head. There was a dirt floor, no light back then, with an insanely heavy steel door. You would have to relieve yourself right where you sat or stood. Your food would be put on a tray and dropped on the floor in front of you. There you would remain, however long your penalty was set for. This was no joke. It was a place where the rats began to look more appetizing than your portioned prison slop. Next, we were brought to the massive mess hall. This was a very interesting place to me. There were large white boards at the front of the kitchen with black stenciled outlines of all the eating utensils. Every fork, every spoon, every knife, the count of trays, whatever utensils would be given out to the inmates were outlined in a sketch or stencil type black paint on these white boards. This way the guards can keep track and get a count and accountability of all the utensils returning to their place after the mess. The mess hall would be locked down. No one left the room until every utensil was returned and accounted for. You did not want to be the guy found to have kept a utensil. That would call for an immediate search and beatdown. That was not a good thing to do. Made me wonder how the escapees had gotten their spoons that they used in their escape from the kitchen. They probably didn't. They probably had them smuggled in. No one knows the answer to this day. I asked. There were several placements of liquid chemical gas bombs, which could be seen strategically placed high up on the walls near the ceiling. They could be dropped at any time by the guard staff. Prison guards were assigned to each table to watch over and for inmate control during mess. It seemed very much regimented. It reminded me of the scene in the old James Cagney movie, White Heat, where Cagney is in the mess hall during mess and he is told through whispering down the lane that his mother has died. He was suffering from severe migraine headaches during his stay in the prison. When he gets the news that Ma died, he immediately stops eating, rises from where he was seating, and goes completely berserk, causing a huge ruckus, and the guards are on top of him like a monkey on a strawberry shortcake. I noted that my entire tour outside the prison, you heard the constant song of squawking seahawks, which inhabit the rock. Their droppings are seen all over the surrounding rocks of the prison. When you were inside the confines of the exceedingly thick concrete walls of the cell block, you could still hear the squawking of the birds. It was muted, but still hauntingly there. I wondered how long it would take for that constant noise to drive a man insane. But maybe that was just me. I don't know. Like a quote from the Tom Hanks movie, The Green Mile, it was enough to cause the cheese to slide off your cracker. The end. This is Detective Sergeant First Class Harry Gavel, Homicide Division, CCPO, retired. Join us next time for a story from the murder capital. See you next time.